In this first lecture of the new unit on stars, we're going to look at the main source of knowledge that we have about stars. Since the sun and other stars are not only incredibly hot, but are also sources of incredibly dangerous radiation, we cannot visit them. We must study them from Earth using a science called spectroscopy. Spectroscopy is the study of spectra. Spectra is plural for spectrum. Each element has their own chemical signature that acts like a fingerprint, and this gives us a vast amount of knowledge about our celestial neighbors. This PowerPoint is partially adapted from Stanford's Solar Center presentation on spectral analysis. Stars are inherently difficult to study because they are so far away. Even through a telescope, all stars other than the sun still look like a point of light. We don't have a way to travel to these distant locations, so we can only study them using different types of light they emit. Each different type of light can give us different information about the source body, and the purpose of spectroscopy is to learn how to read these types of light. We've talked a little bit about EM, or electromagnetic radiation, already. These are the different types of light that range from longer wavelength radio waves through infrared, visible light, ultraviolet, X-ray, and the highest energy gamma ray radiation. Anything in the universe that is warmer than absolute zero, negative 273 degrees Celsius, emits some type of this light radiation. All stars, including the sun, are blackbody emitters, meaning that they emit a continuous spectrum, all types of radiation. The only type of radiation humans can see is visible light. This white light can be broken up by a prism into the different colors we see characterized by a different wavelength. This is very similar to how rainbows form when light passes through rain droplets. When we look at the spectrum of a star, we can look at the wavelengths of light energy present and collect a lot of different types of information. An instrument called a spectroscope, or a spectrograph, contains a prism which breaks up the light from a star. In the top image, you can see a continuous spectrum of visible light. This band of colors ranging from the shortest wavelength, violet light, through the longest wavelength, red light. You are probably familiar with the mnemonic Roy G. Biv, which is the spectrum of the colors in the opposite order, starting at red and going toward violet. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Simple spectrographs contain diffraction gratings that look like a simple piece of clear plastic. However, these pieces of plastic have thousands of thin parallel lines cut into them. Light has to bend to go through the slits, and this bending of light causes the different wavelengths of light to be separated. In the images, you see a simple box spectroscope, often used by grade school students, a diffraction grating that looks similar to an old slide, and this slide produces a continuous spectrum, much like what you would see in the back side of a CD. More complex spectroscopes function more like the slit method in the bottom image. Most astronomy is done with spectroscopes. Though we often think about astronomers sitting in the dark looking through telescopes, that's actually pretty rare. Human eyes are so limited in that we can only see one tiny part of the entire spectrum. These spectroscopic devices allow us to gain a lot more information than what we can collect with our eyes. Even simple handmade spectroscopes can tell us a lot, but many space telescopes, including the Hubble, are also equipped with spectrographs. In the top image, you can see another image of a continuous spectrum, a solid rainbow from violet to red or vice versa, without any gaps. There are two different ways spectroscopes can be configured. They can create what are called bright line spectra, seen in the second image, where there are certain lines that stand out as brighter than the background, or they may be dark line or absorption spectra, seen in the last image, where there appear to be dark gaps in the spectra. These lines, whether dark or bright, are the data that tell us about stars. Each element produces a unique spectrum that is kind of like its fingerprint. When electrical energy is passed through a sample of gas, it glows. When that light is passed through a spectroscope, the light is broken into a spectrum. The bright or dark lines tell us the elements that are present in the sample. For example, in this spectrum, can you see that there is a bright red line to the right and a couple of bright lines, one blue and one violet, that stand out a little bit more than the background on the left? This is the spectrum of hydrogen. If our spectroscope that produced this spectrum was pointed at a star, we would know that that star is composed of hydrogen. Again, each element is unique, different than each other element. The first two spectra shown are both for hydrogen. The top one is a bright line spectrum, and the lower one is a dark line spectrum. Can you see how the lines of each one match up? And they're both for the same element. Now, can you see how those are different than the third one labeled helium? Helium has 2 red lines instead of 1, a yellow line, and several more in the blue and violet end of the spectrum. Sodium has a characteristic pair of lines in the yellow part of the spectrum. Here are the spectra of several elements that are found in the sun. Each set of lines is unique for each of the elements. Combining all these elements, we get the complete spectrum of the sun seen at the bottom of the screen. I keep using the word lines when talking about those vertical line segments. These lines are created as the light passes through the narrow slits in the spectroscope itself. They can be either absorption lines, dark lines on a rainbow background, or emission lines, bright lines on a dark background. We can only see the lines in the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum, but the lines can be anywhere. For example, there could be lines in the radio part of the spectrum and in the ultraviolet part of the spectrum too. Depending on what type of light source you have, the shape of the spectrum may vary. The lines may even have some curvature to them. Here you see a few more examples of different types of light bulbs. Each type emits light in different wavelengths because each type of bulb is burning different material. Compare these sets of lines specifically. Hopefully it's clear that there is no mercury in the old-style fluorescent bulbs. There is no matching pattern of 2 green lines and 1 blue line that we see present in the mercury. However, we do see those lines present in the new style fluorescent bulb. These newer bulbs aren't 100% mercury, as there are other spectral lines present, but as the blue and the green lines match up, we know mercury is contained in these bulbs. That's why you aren't supposed to throw away these light bulbs in the regular trash. You're supposed to take them to be recycled so the mercury isn't released into the landfill. The lines are created by electrons. Take a look at the image. This is a simple model of an atom. The red and black blob in the center is the nucleus, where the protons and neutrons live. The small blue dots around the outside are the electrons. Though they have certain orbits where they are stable, adding energy to the atom can cause an electron to jump up to a higher level. But the electron will not remain there for long. It will eventually drop back down, releasing its energy. So electrons can either absorb energy and jump up a level, or they can release energy and drop back down. Since these transitions require a specific amount of energy, the amount of light and the color or wavelength that is seen by a specific element's electrons in its spectrum will always be the same. If one hydrogen atom has 1 red, 1 blue, and 1 violet spectral line, all other hydrogen atoms will look exactly the same. Understanding hydrogen is important because it's the most abundant element in stars. Hydrogen alpha telescopes are the most common form of telescope that we use for amateur solar astronomy. PSC owns 2 of these scopes. H-alpha telescopes are looking at very specific wavelength of light produced by hydrogen atoms. They're not looking at the entire spectrum of visible light. See the arrow pointing to the bright red line? That's the wavelength this type of telescope is looking for. Here is that same color or wavelength of light seen in the rainbow way over to the red side. Looking through an HA telescope, the sun will always appear red, as this type of scope only allows that wavelength of light through. It allows us to see only the light that is present at the very surface of the sun, allowing us to see storms occurring on the sun's surface, as you can see here. Here is a nice image that shows most of what we're talking about here, all in one picture. You see a star up in the top left corner. if we simply shine normal sunlight through a prism, we get the continuous spectrum seen in diagram A, a solid rainbow from violet to red. However, if we're looking at a different source, for example, this cloud of hydrogen gas, we produce a specific set of lines that are unique to that element, either as an absorption spectrum showing the dark line seen in diagram B, or as an emission spectrum showing bright lines seen in diagram C. Each element has a specific set of lines at a specific temperature, so laboratory spectra are relatively simple. Now look at this actual spectrum of the sun. This is ridiculously complex. This is a very high-resolution image, chopped up into thin strips and then stacked up. As mentioned on the previous slide, the sun emits all wavelengths of light, a continuous spectrum. However, the sun's surface is anything but calm and tranquil. Photons of light are constantly being bounced around, absorbed, and re-emitted. Because of that, there are bits of the spectrum that do not reach us here on Earth. That is the reason for the gaps in the spectrum. This image shows how light emitted from different types of atoms get bounced around as it leaves the solar surface. That randomization is what produces the solar spectrum we see. For this spectrum, we can identify not only the composition of the star, meaning what elements it's made of, but also the temperature of the star, how it's moving, and even information about its magnetic field. Data collected by spectroscopes is often graphed in terms of intensity, or how strong a feature is. In this particular graph, you should be able to count 6 strong features. Spectroscopy is often used in a very simple way to determine the chemical composition of a light source. In our activity, we're going to look at a few different elements to see how they are different. This is simple in a lab, as it's easy to control your sample. In space, however, it's more challenging to know whether the light you're looking at is actually coming from the body you're interested in or a gas cloud between it and the Earth. In this graph, we're measuring the intensity of each wavelength of light to determine the temperature of the star. The temperature of the star is determined by the peak intensity emitted. Light spectra can also tell us how a source of light is moving. A moving source of light shifts the spectrum of that light to one side of the spectrum. This is called a Doppler shift. You've all heard this with sound waves. Ever notice how a police or ambulance siren sounds really high-pitched as it comes toward you, but as soon as it passes you, the pitch falls? This is because the sound waves scrunch up in front of the source as it approaches you, but then stretch as they recede away from you. The same thing happens with light. The top image shows the spectrum of hydrogen taken in a lab. Can you see that in the second image, you have the exact same set of 5 lines, but they are shifted just a bit toward the 700 nanometer side or the red side of the spectrum? That means that this object is moving away from us. This is called a redshift. Had the lines been pushed off to the 400 nanometer or the blue side of the spectrum, we would know that the source of hydrogen was moving toward us. This is called a blue shift. Don't worry about the math at the bottom of the slide right now. We'll get to that in a later lecture. Here you see a sodium spectrum emitted from 3 different locations. On Earth, we see this set of 3 lines. When a sodium atom releases light energy from a nearby galaxy, can you see that those lines are still spaced the exact same way, but that they're shifted to the right? Then, from the distant galaxy, they are shifted even more to the right? These galaxies must be moving away from the Earth. The wavelengths are being stretched as the objects are speeding away from us. Imagine that you and a friend are each holding one side of a giant rubber band, as your friend starts running away with his side. As he runs, the band stretches. A stretched wavelength is a longer wavelength. The red end of the spectrum are the longer wavelength waves. Finally, star spectra can also tell us about magnetism. See how the band by the arrow splits into thirds in the middle? It's important for us to understand the magnetic field of the sun, as magnetic storms on the sun can cause major problems for us here on Earth. Many of the photos of the sun we'll look at in this unit were taken by NASA's SDO, or Solar Dynamics Observatory. One of these three instruments, the HMI, is much like a spectroscope that measures the sun's magnetic field during sunquakes. Here are just a few images that show the observatory. Now you're going to do a short activity to look at how we use spectroscopes to study the sun.